built a lot of confidence in me as both a leader and just a female executive and a female in business. But it also certainly helped me to see that that is not the norm. There's challenges at every level, big companies, small companies. I talk to startup leaders and VPs almost every day that are trying to figure out how do we create more diversity. Obviously, the female seller and the female executive is kind of the lane that I typically play in, or my lens, but there is still a massive challenge.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. That was Catie Ivey. And Catie's the Regional Vice President responsible for all new logo acquisition in the mid-market space for DemandBase. And in my conversation with Catie, we dive into a number of interesting topics. First, how she had an epic fail in her first sales interview. And I identified with that because I, too, had an epic fail in my first sales interview. Talk about how she's dealt with self-doubt. I mean, you aren't a human if you've never fought with self-doubt if you're in sales, or if you're maybe just not being honest with yourself. We've dive into why she believes that working in sales has given her the ability to accomplish more than she ever dreamed possible, how she's overcome the obstacles that are placed in the way of women in sales, and the steps she's taken to encourage more women to seek out a career in sales and sales leadership. So all this and much, much more, let's jump into it with Catie Ivey. Catie, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So where have you been hanging out during the pandemic?
I have been hanging out primarily in Atlanta. I was in New York prior to COVID, bouncing between Atlanta and New York, and actually just made it back up to New York for the first time last week. But other than that, I've been staying put.
And how was that airplane flight?
So we actually drove.
Oh, you drove?
I had an apartment up there that I needed to move a bunch of stuff out of. So we did a 2-day road trip from Atlanta to New York, also in an electric car. So some charging along the way. It was quite the adventure, I tell you.
Well, a Tesla?
Yeah. Yep.
So, all right. So you could have the map. You had that showed you where the charging stations were and so on?
Yeah, it was our longest trip in the Tesla since we've had it, but it was great, uneventful. It was fantastic.
Now, did you have to wait at any of the charging stations, or because it tells you which ones, how many chargers are available, right?
Yes, we have never had an instance where we pulled into one and one wasn't available. So no.
And then how long does it take to charge it?
Depends. It tells you exactly how long you need. Usually somewhere between 20 minutes and upwards of an hour, depending on how much juice you need to get to the next stop.
Interesting.
Yeah, we always try to time it where there was meals or something that we wanted to do if it was a longer stop. So it was actually a really relaxing way to travel.
Huh. Yeah, I was before COVID. I was thinking about that. I thought, my next car should be an electric car, right? Be a good citizen and do that. But yeah, that also got sidetracked. I don't have any place to drive right now.
Yeah, we haven't done as much driving as we were expecting. That's for sure.
So, big question for you though. So what's the biggest lesson you've learned about yourself during the pandemic?
Oh, that is a big question. I have learned a lot. Funny enough, one of the things that I had put on my list at the beginning of the year that I wanted to really lean into and get better at was remote management, which I had never done a ton of before. And so the universe conspired against me. And now I have learned a lot about managing teams and leaders remote. Still a work in progress, still definitely learning a lot.
What did you learn?
So there's a number of things that I would point out around. I'm really good at culture and team building, being able to read a room's feel out where the energy levels are, kind of feed into the right things and pull people out of their shell and drive a lot of engagement, especially in a face-to-face environment, both with teams as well as in a sales environment.
Sure.
So learning to do that remote has been an interesting adventure or challenge. Doing some of it over Zoom, been making some progress, I think, with just different ways to structure both one-on-ones and team meetings. Asking a lot more questions, just one, recognizing that things take longer, at least for me in a remote environment. I have to be very purposeful with how I use my time because a lot of the things, at least those kind of magic moments that you have as a leader or as a manager that just kind of happen organically, don't happen organically when you're in a virtual environment. So I've had to get much more organized with how I spend my time to make sure that I'm making the right level of connections and getting the right things done. That's probably been one of the biggest. I've had to become much more structured in my scheduling.
Well, in terms of your managing and coaching, what have you found that you've had to change in terms of maybe how you structure a conversation, how you open a conversation, those types of things?
Yeah, I don't know that when we think about a one-on-one environment, the way that I'm actually structuring conversations and even the questions that I'm asking, I don't think that those have had to change quite as much. Probably the biggest change is it's required more prep on my side. So even when we think about deal coaching or pipeline reviews or bigger picture sales conversations,
Mm-hmm.
I think I underestimated how much of that I absorb just by being in the same vicinity of people and picking up
Right.
on very
Right.
small micro things that are happening.
Right.
And I can latch onto those moments and ask really smart layering questions around very small specific things. To do that virtually, I've got to spend the time to drill into, typically it's gong conversations, but some type of recorded conversations that are happening, and then be able to pull out those more micro nuggets. Initially, when we switched to everything to remote, I think the knee-jerk reaction for a lot of us that were, first and second line managers was almost to go into this hyper micro management mode where we got really involved in everything really fast.
Right.
And that is certainly not scalable, also not the best experience for the team. So finding ways to still find those micro moments and small coaching opportunities, you just have to be really deliberate to do it, I think.
I think it's a fantastic lesson for people listening to absorb, which is that, yeah, you don't have the, as you said, sort of the things you learn by osmosis, by being in an office, by being in physical proximity to people, that instead you have to dig for it and prep.
Yeah, for sure. And I think
Love
you have
it.
to pick your battles a little bit more clearly as well. So decide the one or two very specific things that you want to either pay attention to, or even just the key strength that you're really trying to lean into with a rep or a leader, and find very specific ways to pull that out versus trying to, boil the ocean and have opinions on lots of broad things. Because time is more valuable and more of it is required, I think we have to be more specific in what our end goal and end result is that we're looking for.
Yeah, because you're missing the casual conversations where you could communicate some of that stuff before.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Now, I had read somewhere on LinkedIn you had said that, we're just going to dig into your background a little bit, is that you badly bombed, I think there's a quote, badly bombed your first sales interview. So I did too. So that's why it resonated with me. So we'll have to compare stories. So you go first.
Sure. Well, I got the job, so I guess I didn't bomb it quite as badly as I thought. I was just very, very green. I had a bit of an interesting background where I spent almost 5 years overseas working for a nonprofit before I went to college. So I had some leadership.
Well, hang on. Tell us about that. What were you doing?
Sure. I worked for a religious nonprofit called Youth with a Mission. It was meant to be a 6-month, like a gap year in between high school and college, because I graduated school.
5 years.
Yeah, I graduated school 6 months or a year early. So I was going to take a little break, which turned into a much longer break. But I did a ton of traveling, led a lot of groups, did a lot of fundraising, just learned a ton. It was also my first exposure to anything non-Western and just outside of the US in general.
So where were you?
So I lived in Australia, up in the Northeast, really small town on the Northeast coast of Australia, and then spent a lot of time all through Southeast Asia and different Pacific islands. Yeah, so traveled a ton. So I had an interesting background before school, but then I studied political science, so literally knew nothing about business. When I say nothing about business, other than watching,
you mean nothing? Yes.
I mean nothing. Other than watching my entrepreneurial father start a tire store when I was a kid, like that was as much of business as I had ever wrapped my head around. And so land in this sales interview job. And first of all, I talk really, really fast. And this is me, learning to try to slow down for 10 years. So you can imagine how fast I talked 10 years ago or 12 years ago.
You and I share that same quality.
Knew nothing about business. We did different role plays. At one point, we'd done a role play. It was super simple. They'd asked me to do something again with a stronger value proposition. My response was, what is a value proposition? Like I just had no concept of some very basic things. But I was really good with people and I had some experience leading teams. So I think that's what got my foot in the door. Luckily, I was gritty and a fast learner. So I figured things out. But yeah, I was certainly not the natural seller coming right out of college for sure.
And that was a job to sell what?
It was for a company called Meltwater, which sold PR software. It's evolved a lot. They do a lot of different things now relative to PR software. Back then, we were basically selling a paid version of Google Alerts, but it was to help folks understand what's going on in the news around their company.
So is it a reasonable expectation to think that someone interviewing for the first sales job should know what a value proposition is?
I mean, reasonable. I think so. I think that the folks that were interviewing me certainly could see the aspects of both my personality as well as how I was wired to understand that I was going to have the aptitude to pick things up. I think things have evolved quite a bit. I mean, at least the college students that I interact with. I mean, I have folks reach out to me on LinkedIn all the time, and there's so much interaction and engagement that's happening, I think, even for 18, 19, 20-year-olds. So from my perspective, the bar has raised, I think, a little bit. I think it was in no way a negative on me, that it was maybe a positive that I knew very little about business. The core is to find someone that's genuinely curious. I talk a lot about intellectual curiosity, and I'm just fascinated by people. I'm fascinated by companies. I didn't know that back then, that I was going to love business so much, but I'm fascinated with how companies make money and how they go to market. So if you can tie those two things together, I think folks can learn just about anything.
Yeah, I tell the story that I graduated from college with no discernible job skills, but I had two things. One, I had an insatiable curiosity and a competitive streak a mile wide. And so I went into sales. And yeah, I had no idea either what I was getting into. So my story, just quickly, and I think I've told this on the show before, is interviewing for a job with a company called Burroughs, at the time second largest computer company in the world, and to sell computer systems to small and mid-sized businesses for accounting applications. So all the general ledger applications. And I get taken into a conference room with the guy who was the hiring manager. And the first question out of his mouth, first words out of his mouth, basically were an accounting question. And I can't quite remember what the question was, and I'd taken accounting in college and I'd done actually pretty well in it. But it was not what I was expecting on my first job interview. You
thought they were going to lead with a softball, probably, right?
Yeah. How are you, at least, right? And I froze. And it seemed like one of those indefinite pregnant pauses. And I just like, oh my God, the only thought really going through my mind at that point was, how am I going to tell my parents how I screwed this up so badly? And so I said to him, well, Ray, here's the thing is I know the answer to that question. You could see, you got my transcript in front of you. I've taken accounting, but I wasn't expecting it, and I blanked out. So can I go home tonight? I'll get the answer for you, and I'll call you tomorrow with the answer. No, this was pre-email and so on. And without a word, he stands up and leaves the room. I'm like, oh, shit. I literally, it's one of those things like in a movie where you put your head down on the table in front of you. It's like, but then, like 5 minutes later, this other gentleman comes in the room and he introduces himself and he says, hey, I'm Brian. I'm Ray's boss. So Ray says he wants to hire you. And I thought, yeah, what an incredible lesson to learn. At the time, I didn't think it, but I mean, in retrospect, it's like, what an incredible lesson to learn, especially going into sales, is tell the truth, operate with integrity. Don't try to BS your way through things. And yeah, that's obviously stuck with me the rest of my career.
That's awesome. And be willing to ask for second chances. You owned up to your mistake and made the ask of what you wanted, which obviously pays off in sales.
It does. Well, I mean, we all screw up in sales. Holy cow. I mean, it's every time you go into a sales situation, it's full of unknowns. So you are going to make mistakes.
I love that. So you landed the job. It's amazing.
I did. And they did. The follow-up to that question, though, or to that story was that, so I went to my first sales training class, like, I don't know, 4 weeks later. And big companies then, we all went to, in this case, Pasadena, California, and with like 25 other people from around the country, newbies starting. And you get sent back after 2 weeks with this evaluation from the instructor of the course that you have to hand to your branch manager. No words, no questions asked type thing. And they thought, basically they recommended that they fire me because I was too analytical. I'd never make a good salesperson.
Interesting.
So
one of my earliest bosses said that I would never get promoted because I didn't like sales enough. And if you've ever met me, you, or at least these days, I like sales a lot.
A lot, yeah. Well, back then it was for me, this was some time ago. There was a stereotype, and I didn't fit the stereotype. I was introverted. The sales training class consisted of a lot of sort of role plays that were, they prized extroversion over actually getting the job done. And that just wasn't me. And yeah, I'm always the person who want to know, well, why should we do this? And they didn't like that. So yeah, that was the curiosity.
Good lesson for hiring managers, myself included.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if people have questions, you want those people. So you said that you sort of doubted yourself early on. What was that self-doubt?
I just was very aware that I had a lot to learn. I mean, I think to this day, we all struggle with imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
There was certainly a lot of layers of, do I really have the chops to figure this out? I think more of it was just an insecurity and a nerves factor. And this was back when, it was full cycle sales. So everything from the cold call to the demos to the close, relatively simple product. But because there were so many gaps in my knowledge around how businesses actually operate and make money, there was a lot of instances of not knowing how to adequately direct that process. So there were certainly nerves there. I think pretty early on, though, I learned, one, I'm a really hard worker and I'm also competitive, like what you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So I was not afraid to, prospect late into the night or do whatever it took to make sure I came into the office with more leads than the person next to me so that I would get the number of at-bats that I needed to actually figure things out. But I think that I did learn how to rest on the things that I was good at while I was becoming aware of the gaps and things that I had to learn. I talk about that a ton with reps that I manage today and even managers that I manage, right. Figuring out their strengths. If you can find we all have one or two superpowers or things that we're uniquely really good at, figure out what those are, lean in. The other stuff can take care of itself along the way. At least that's what I found.
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, I basically have spent my entire career in complex technical fields and, with no technical training at all. So, but as we talked about, we led off the conversation, very curious. So that's basically how I chose jobs, was what could I learn? And if it required that I learn something completely new, then more the better, right?
Bring it on, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was very fortunate. My first job was selling these accounting systems to small and mid-sized businesses. I learned business. That's the thing, is when you're selling accounts receivable, accounts payable, payroll, general ledger, job cost accounting, and so on, you learn how business operates. And when your customers are CEOs and CFOs or controllers, oftentimes for those companies. Yeah, to your question is how do you make money?
Yep.
And you referred to somewhere I saw it on LinkedIn is questions to ask. Because this is a question you just don't hear. Well, I think we don't train sellers to ask it. How does my customer make money? Yeah,
feels so basic, right?
Right, but for new sellers, this is a great question to know the answer to, but a great question to ask so you can learn the answer is, if you don't know, ask. And the customer, oftentimes, my experience has been, especially when you're newer in sales, the customers will teach you how to sell to them because they'll tell you what's important if you ask.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. And I think doing that initial level of research, where even if you are very junior or young in your career, if you've spent some time digging into what you see on the website, done a little bit of your own research, you can come to the table with relatively intelligent questions, even if there are some gaps. I mean, to this day, there's companies that I have meetings with, and I know a lot about business by this point, but I've read all the articles, I've done all the things. Hey, I still have a question about this aspect of your go-to-market. I've read this and I see this, but let's dig in here because there's a gap in me connecting the dots in terms of how we're going to be able to help you. And folks they love that question or that type of question.
Right. And don't be afraid to ask it. Because people talk about resilience in sales and so on. I think part of the resilience is not just handling rejection. It's having the confidence you can ask a question that somebody else may think is too elementary or, quote unquote, the dumb question. And rarely I've had a problem with customers when you want to ask about their business. They want to tell you.
And to your earlier point around humility, the example that you gave from your interview, being honest or being transparent, sometimes admitting like, I don't fully understand what you just said. Let's dig a little bit deeper. Wait, I think I need another explanation or another example. Being willing to ask one more time until you actually get it is so key.
Well, exactly. We're kindred spirits here. And this is because I tell people is one of the biggest sources of value you as a seller can provide to a buyer is to make them feel understood.
Yeah, for sure.
And so when we have complaints from executives about dealing with sellers not being able to add value to a conversation, well, you certainly can't add value if you don't understand what their challenges are. If you don't really understand what it is they're trying to accomplish, what their desired outcomes are, what the problem is they're trying to solve. And to your point earlier, is I've never had a customer or buyer resent the second or third or fourth question that tries to clarify and understand exactly what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's so common too, and it differs depending on the size and complexity of the deals. But I think of reps that work for me, and they're really smart, really talented reps. But sometimes they just get super busy and they get in the motions and they're going through this sales process that they know relatively well. And sometimes they forget to stop and think about the basics. Sometimes it's how does this company make money? More often than not, it's what problems are we really trying to help them solve? And if you can't answer that, then it doesn't matter how many details you can give me about the business and the stakeholders and all the different executive sponsors and the features and functions they need. If you don't really know the business problem they're trying to solve, then we're probably not going to win the deal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we all have self-doubt and this imposter syndrome, as you talked about. But one of the things you can arm yourself with as a seller is understanding. Right? If you want to have self-confidence as a salesperson, when you really understand what a customer is trying to achieve, you're going to start feeling it, right? Because you know, compared to perhaps your competitor or anybody else, you've got it, right? You can help them because you understand what they're trying to do. Now you can really help them.
Yeah, it's a great point.
So is there a point in your career where suddenly it's like, yeah, it started making sense? I mean, like was there an epiphany or a particular coach or mentor that really made a difference?
I think there's been a lot of those small moments. It was probably 2 years into that first job that I started to realize that I was genuinely good at selling and helping other folks learn how to sell. So there was a few small moments there. And some of it was just winning certain deals. Like I have a couple of very specific deals that I remember getting across the finish line and almost being surprised that I was able to win or able to land a contract that today would feel really small, but back then felt like this huge whale or this big accomplishment. I think probably the bigger epiphanies for me have come more recently in my career as I've started managing slightly larger teams and understanding some of what I bring to the table more as an executive. It's always refreshing, obviously, but that's come in different layers of mentoring and coaching and recognizing, even to my earlier point, leaning further into those superpowers and things that I am uniquely good at and realizing that I can give myself the freedom to actually manage through those versus fixating on maybe the other areas where I'm not as naturally gifted or not as strong.
So your management superpower is what?
So I see people really well. And typically that starts with seeing their strengths and then helping them solve for gaps and weaknesses and challenges. But it typically is focused on helping them see potential in themselves that they don't yet recognize. I'm also really good at helping teams work together and building culture and almost that multiplier effect of 1 + 1 equaling 3 or 4, or creating those environments where we're genuinely better because of the unit that we're creating and the positivity. Those would probably be the two biggest things that I would consider myself uniquely strong at.
Yeah, interesting. So what have been sort of the biggest barriers? Because you've had a lot of success so far in your career, but you sort of skirted around this earlier. I was expecting you to bring up, but as a woman in sales, what have been sort of the biggest barriers you've had to overcome?
I feel really, really blessed by the companies that I've landed at. I feel like I've worked for some great bosses, men and women, and I have genuinely felt empowered at almost every step along the way. I've also worked in some pretty diverse environments during the time that I was at Marketo, which is where I ran a commercial team before my current job at DemandBase. I was there for almost 3 years. My direct boss that ran our entire mid-market business was a female. And then almost 80% of the team that reported to me were female sellers. And one of the strongest teams one of the strongest teams in the entire business, just a lot of really, really great wins during that season. I think that built a lot of confidence in me as both a leader and just a female executive and a female in business. But it also certainly helped me to see that is not the norm. There's challenges at every level, big companies, small companies. I talk to startup leaders and VPs almost every day that are trying to figure out how do we create more diversity. Obviously the female seller and the female executive is kind of the lane that I typically play in, or my lens. But there is still a massive challenge. Certainly as you work your way up, I think the latest stat I've seen is it's like 27% of, if you get to the director level above in sales, are females. It's much lower even if you get to a VP and higher.
Yep.
So there's a lot of gaps there and a lot of opportunities. I just personally feel very fortunate that even that first company that I landed in right out of college, the types of diversity we also had it was global. So there's a lot of just international flavor that I think helped foster that. But I certainly did not grow up in that all white, all male boys club, Silicon Valley type startup, which I'm really grateful for.
And clearly at Marketo. So what was Marketo doing to attract women sellers? Because that's one of the challenges you hear all the time from female sales leaders is there just aren't enough candidates for me to evaluate. How'd they do that?
Yeah, I don't buy that. I don't buy that at the seller level or at the manager level.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are phenomenal candidates. I think we often are not looking in the right places. If we're waiting for those candidates to show up in our, greenhouse or in our, job boards or to organically apply for the various roles, then there's certainly going to be almost always a delta. And I see that even for roles that I hire today. I think one thing that we did really well at Marketo is go out and find folks. And then we did hire within our network some, which is also a reason that once you have lack of diversity within an organization, it can become very challenging very fast because you naturally hire your friends and you hire people that look like you and are in a similar stage of life. And I think that when Marketo opened their Atlanta office, so it was essentially their East Coast hub, and this was 5 or 6 years ago, they did a really good job with the first round of hires. And then the female that I was reporting into just drove a lot of diversity from that first layer, which then allowed us to create this really healthy cycle of both organic, inorganic, and inorganic talent that we were sourcing.
So, but where were they going to find people? You're saying, they weren't waiting. We all know, the problems with job descriptions are so male oriented in sales on the job boards and so on. But what were they doing that was sort of non-traditional in terms of sourcing candidates?
Well, one, we were finding people in person. So we were engaged in a lot of different networking events. We were lucky to have strong female leaders, myself being one of them, but certainly others that were really active in the community, well networked, well connected, speaking at events, getting to know folks, mentoring young individuals in different companies. So that created a pretty consistent just flow of talent. The other thing that, and I don't know if we necessarily did this particularly differently at Marketo, but one thing that certainly works today is be vocal on social with what you are looking for. Put it out there. If you recognize that there's a gap, I tell the story of Scott Leese is a friend of mine, runs a podcast. He recognized that his podcast guests as of late had been relatively non-diverse. It was a lot of white dudes that he'd had on. So he just put it out there on Twitter. He literally asked the question, hey, I want more diversity and more females speaking on the podcast. Anyone want to volunteer or any recommendations? I think it was 48 hours. He was booked for the next 6 months, basically, with very diverse talent. And the same goes, I think, for the recs that we're trying to fill and jobs that and individuals that we're looking for. Just be vocal with what you're looking for, what the gaps are, and own up to the challenge. In particular, if you're a company that does not look diverse, if your website is very white, very male, you're going to have to own that and acknowledge if you want to have powerhouse females or people of color or any other types of diversity join your team. One of the challenges you find is if your company doesn't look like someone that I want to work for, I'm probably not going to go apply for your next, VP of sales role. You're going to have to come find me and convince me of what it is that you're trying to do to drive that type of diversity.
Yeah. I had a guest on the show recently who used the phrase as, she first sales job she looked at, she didn't see anybody that looked like her.
Yep.
And that was obviously dissuasive, right? It's just like, I don't want to go there. So have you had to make culture changes? Any place that you've been in charge, where there has been sort of nascent bro sales culture or an established bro sales culture? And if so, what'd you do?
Honestly, I'm having trouble thinking of a specific example that comes to mind. Every company has their aspect of culture that needs to be tweaked, for sure. So there's certainly opportunities to grow and evolve and improve. I can't think of an example where I felt like I was brought into a bro-y culture that we had to immediately fix. I will say in my current role, we're purposefully looking for and trying to hire for more diversity as we speak, but not because I think we have a super fractured, challenging culture, but I think that we can do better and we want to do better.
Yeah, I saw some stat recently. I think it was close to 3/4 of B2B sellers in the U.S. are white males.
Yep.
So
I think there's also an element, though, and I talk about this a lot on LinkedIn and different things that I publish. I spend a lot of time encouraging women to be more vocal and to put up their hands for the jobs that they want. There's a lot of research around how just females from a very early age, we're bred and instilled this sense of needing to be perfect.
Right.
And so we are almost wired from literally early childhood to not ask for things or expect things until we feel like we have the job requirements, 100% of what that person's looking for, versus males that put up their hand much earlier in the process. So I think that there's a balance on both sides. Absolutely, employers and hiring managers, we need to do better. And I think we have a moral imperative to do better. But I think there's also opportunities where we need to challenge, and I spend a lot of time challenging my female fellow salespeople and sales leaders that we've got to get out there and ask for what we want, know our worth, be willing to be a little bit pushy, not be so concerned about whether we're going to be perceived as, aggressive or bitchy, and make the ask and put up our hands, even if we don't feel 100% qualified.
So have you come across any sort of research? And this is, I saw one thing. It was 4 years or so ago. An insurance company had done research into relative performance of women versus men in sales. And on balance, the women performed statistically better, immeasurably better than their male counterparts. And I was wondering if we've seen any other research around that, because I don't know. My gut feel tells me that as we continue to proceed down this path we are, with more and more technology coming into the space, that the differentiator more and more between competitors, between sellers, is going to be this ability to really connect on a human level.
Yep.
And I don't want to sound sexist in another direction, but I think this is a trait that women on balance do better than men.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And there are some different studies that have come out recently. There's it depends on how you slice and dice the data and the specific fields and things that you're looking at. But there certainly are numerous studies that peg women slightly higher in terms of just quota attainment and achievement from a sales org perspective. Mm-hmm. I think your point's very, very valid in terms of, even something as simple as empathy and being able to my earlier point, read a room, perceive emotions relatively quickly, and then be able to pivot based on the other emotions and factors that are going on around you. Women naturally, many of us are good at that. I think stereotypes, though, can be really dangerous.
Right. In either direction, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would be hesitant to say that we're going to continue to further outpace, men in these different environments. But I think there's a lot of opportunity as we recognize, even to your point, this genuine human connection, building relationships, building trust, and being able to read the room and understand how to do that with a wide variety of people has never been more valuable than it is today.
Yeah, and I asked somebody a question once. I sort of phrased it as it's just a hypothetical. But I said, this person, because we were sort of having this. It was a guy and in sales. I said, so close your eyes for a second. I said, so think about and just imagine in your mind sort of somebody that's stereotypical salesperson, these bad exhibiting these bad sales behaviors that we've become stereotypical over the years, but we still see, unfortunately. I said, you hold that image in your mind. I said, so is that person a man or a woman?
Good question.
It's always a man.
Yep.
Every time I've asked the question, it's always a man.
There's another opportunity for us then. We don't have quite as many negative baggage that we've got to drag along.
Well, but I think the issue ultimately becomes, is to your point about, the research shows that at a minimum, women perform on par with men, if not slightly above. And if that's the case, then why, if you're a company that has a diversity issue with regard to women in sales or women in sales leadership, you have an economic incentive to take steps to try to correct that. And I think that's still elusive for some companies because their culture is so deep-seated. But we know people rationally don't always do things in their best interest, but they should try.
Yeah, they should try. You're right. And it's about so much more than just the gender issue. There's, the countless amounts of research that back up the fact that diverse teams perform better.
Oh, absolutely.
So people that think differently from different backgrounds, different races, different gender, different ethnicities. There is so much more that we can do together when we're surrounded by diversity of thought. And I think that also is another thing that feels obvious because there's so much research on it. But it's really hard for especially some of these small companies and founders and startup folks to wrap their head around why that matters so much from an economic perspective, not to mention the moral imperative, but economically it really matters.
Well, but because I think in the startup world, even though people will say this isn't the case, the fact is if you have less than 2% of equity investments going into companies led by people of color, then people take from that the lesson that, well, maybe we shouldn't be hiring people that are different from us.
Huge mistake.
Yeah, huge mistake. Well, it's a huge mistake starting with the investors and and a huge mistake just hiring purely within your network. The Valley, as you know, the Valley is full of retreads of people that we're fortunate to be in one place at one time, weren't really responsible for a lot of success, but they get, shuffled from company to company.
Yeah, it's interesting, right?
Yeah. All right. So, last thing we're going to wrap up with is something new that I haven't done before. Or I may have done it once before, I guess. So I'm gonna give you some word pairs, and I want you just to give me an instant reaction to one of the two words I give you that pop into mind first. Okay.
Very interesting exercise. Okay.
All right. Buying or selling?
Selling.
Skills or mindset?
Mindset.
Training or coaching?
Coaching.
Outbound or inbound?
Outbound.
Persuasion or influence?
Influence.
Pipeline or win rate?
Pipeline.
Face-to-face or Zoom-to-Zoom?
Oh gosh, I miss face-to-face. So I'll go that.
All right. Two last questions for you. What's the last sales book you read?
I read Never Split the Difference.
Chris Voss, okay.
Yes.
And what's your favorite podcast of the non-sales variety? Because we know your answer for sales podcasts, but for the non-sales variety.
Of course. Brene Brown just launched a podcast called Daring Leadership. I think I have the title right. Her first episode just came out and I listened to it this morning on my walk and it was amazing.
Excellent. All right. Good recommendation. I'll have to check that one out. All right. Well, Catie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Andy. It was great.
So if people want to connect with you, how can they do that?
LinkedIn is the best place. I'm Catie with a C. So Catie Ivey on LinkedIn is the best place to find me.
And Ivy with an E. I-V-E-Y. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, Catie, thank you very much. Look forward to talking again soon.
Thanks, Andy.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking time to listen. I'm so grateful for your support of the show. And I want to thank my guest, Catie Ivey, for sharing her insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you could also leave us a rating or a review, let us know how we're doing. Well, we'd certainly appreciate it. You can do all that on your phone in less than a minute as soon as this episode is over. So thank you for your help. And thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.